My name is Rachel Donovan, and at 42, I never imagined my son's overdose would make me lie to the police with shaking hands and a hollow chest. Standing at the edge of his bedroom that night, watching the paramedics try to bring him back, should have felt like the worst moment of my life, but it wasn't. The worst moment came later, when I realized what I had to do to protect what was left of him. For 7 years, I had lived in quiet denial of the truth I discovered in his drawer that rainy April afternoon. And when he died, I became a criminal to keep it buried. Before I tell you what was inside that drawer, what made the police stop writing and look at me differently, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and hit the like button if you've ever done something wrong because you believed it was right. The day everything shifted began like any other exhausted Tuesday. I'd been working a double at the nursing home, and by the time I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for the blue glow from the living room TV. Jake always left it on, even if he'd fallen asleep on the couch. I remember kicking off my shoes by the door, sighing at the pile of dishes he still hadn't touched, and thinking, not angrily, just automatically, I'll remind him again tomorrow. I didn't go into his room right away. I made a cup of tea. I scrolled through messages. It had been quiet all day, which, with Jake, could mean anything. I knocked before I opened his door, a habit I'd kept even after his 18th birthday, even after he moved back in when the apprenticeship in Miami fell through. The lights were off. I remember the shape of him slumped over the desk, his hoodie pulled around his shoulders like he'd just nodded off mid-scroll. I remember saying his name once, then louder, then grabbing his arm and feeling the cold that shouldn't have been there. My scream was muffled by the carpeting, the tea crashing against the wall, and the way my knees hit the floor too fast to catch myself. The paramedics arrived within 9 minutes. I counted. I followed them with the stubborn, helpless obedience of someone who had seen resuscitations dozens of times at work, but never in her own home. I watched them try and try again, then pause. I kept saying, he was fine this morning, even though I hadn't seen him since Sunday. I couldn't stop myself from lying. Maybe I wanted them to think it wasn't my fault. It wasn't until Officer Healy arrived, broad-shouldered, polite, too young to look so tired, that I realized how fast everything was moving without me. He asked to take a look around. Just protocol, he said. I nodded. I didn't know that just protocol meant opening drawers, flipping through pill bottles, collecting anything that didn't belong. I was still kneeling in the hallway, half holding Jake's backpack like it might still be warm, when I heard the closet door creak open. A pause. Then the sound of latex gloves tightening. I stood too quickly, blood rushing to my ears. Officer Healy held something in his hand, flat, black, and zipped tight like a travel pouch. Ma'am, he said slowly, can you tell me what this is? I opened my mouth, closed it. I had seen that pouch before. I had opened it once, 7 years ago, and what I found inside had taken my breath away, not because of what it meant legally, but because of what it meant about my son. What he was hiding, who he had become, and who he had been protecting. I took the pouch from his hand with a steadiness that surprised even me. It's just old cords, I said. Jake kept all sorts of junk in here. HDMI cables, chargers. The officer didn't press. He made a note. I moved it into the kitchen junk drawer like I was filing coupons. No one stopped me. The pouch stayed zipped. It wasn't until after the autopsy report came in that the real questions began. Fentanyl. Traces of something else. Something synthetic, harder to name. A user's mix, but also a dealer's blend. And when I lied again, when I said I had no idea where he might have gotten it, no, he'd never talked about friends like that. Yes, he'd been clean since the outpatient program last year. I saw the disbelief flicker in their eyes. But they didn't push harder. Maybe they believed I was grieving. Maybe they assumed I simply couldn't handle the truth. But the truth was I could. I had. For years. I just wasn't willing to tell them who Jake had really been. Not yet. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever carried someone's secret so long it became your own? The pouch was still in the junk drawer when Detective Ramos came by a week later. She wasn't in uniform, just a blazer, soft scarf, and eyes that scanned everything like she was memorizing wallpaper. She asked to sit, accepted the coffee I offered without drinking it, and didn't smile once. Her tone was gentle, but I'd been around too many professionals to mistake kindness for leniency. She asked about Jake's habits, his friends, his work history, his mood in the weeks before. I kept my answers short, careful. I said he was quiet, creative. Said he'd been trying to get a job at a local tech place but hadn't heard back. I didn't mention the late-night deliveries or the time I found a second phone under his mattress last spring. She watched me closely, like she already knew I was shaving pieces off the truth. Then she asked if Jake had ever been involved in anything illegal. The pause between her question and my answer felt like falling through ice. No, I said. He wasn't that kind of kid. She didn't argue, just nodded, wrote it down. But when she got up to leave, she let her eyes rest on the kitchen for just a beat longer than needed, right where the drawer sat. If you come across anything that doesn't feel right, she said, anything you think we should know, just give me a call. Doesn't matter how small. I nodded, closed the door behind her. And for the first time since Jake died, I locked it. That night, I opened the pouch again. It still smelled faintly like his room, burnt incense and cheap cologne. Inside were 8 small baggies, 2 with the corners burnt off, 1 with a red X drawn in Sharpie. A roll of cash, all 5s and 20s, rubber banded tight. A phone I didn't recognize. And tucked in the lining, a folded sheet of paper with names and numbers. No dates, just quantities. I stared at the list until the ink blurred. These weren't just customers. They were kids I'd seen in the neighborhood. One name made me choke. Ellie Marks. She'd been in Jake's English class. Her mom still left cookies on our porch every Christmas. I should have called the police. I should have handed everything over, told the truth, let them piece it together. But all I could think about was how my son had once broken his arm climbing a tree just to rescue a neighbor's cat. How he made me tea every time I had a headache. How I had buried him just 5 days earlier in a gray suit that he never would have chosen because it was the only one that didn't smell like smoke. Instead of doing the right thing, I burned the list in the sink. It was only later, when the call started, that I realized what I'd really destroyed. The first one came at midnight, no caller ID. A man's voice, low and casual. You got what belongs to me. I hung up. It rang again 3 minutes later. Same voice. You think Jake didn't know anyone? That stuff's not free. I turned off the phone, yanked out the battery, and shoved it back in the pouch. The next day, my car tires were slashed in the driveway. I didn't report it. I just drove Jake's old bike to work and told my coworkers I was going green. The second call came 2 days after that from a different number, but the same threat. This time they mentioned my address. The porch light I always left on. The fact that I lived alone now. My hands shook so hard I dropped the phone before I could end the call. When I picked it back up, the screen was dark. I stared at it until the battery died. I was no longer just protecting Jake's memory. I was now tangled in whatever he'd left behind. And yet, when the police came back for more follow-up, I still said nothing. He was quiet. I told them again. Didn't talk to many people. Then came the day I saw Ellie Marks's mom at the grocery store. She reached for the same box of cereal I was holding and froze. Her eyes were red. "She's in the hospital," she whispered. "Overdosed Friday. Same stuff as your boy." I stood there, paralyzed, my fingers clenched around the box like it was an anchor. She didn't say it, but I could see it in her face. She suspected. Or maybe she just needed someone to blame. "Did he ever sell things?" she asked suddenly, almost apologetically. "Ellie said something, but we thought." I cut her off with a soft, practiced shake of my head.
No.
Jake wasn't like that. She nodded, looked down, and pushed her card away. But my lie stayed behind. That night, I sat on the kitchen floor with the pouch open in front of me and the police department's number written on a napkin. I hovered my thumb over the dial for 5 full minutes. If I called, everything would unravel. Jake's name, his record, our reputation. They'd label him a dealer. Maybe even blame him for Ellie. Maybe more. But if I stayed silent, someone else might end up dead. I don't know what I would have done if it weren't for the knock at the door.
Quiet.
Deliberate. Like they expected me to be afraid. I froze, then crawled to the window and peeked out. A car idled at the curb, its lights off. A man stood at the step in a hoodie, head down. I didn't answer. After a minute, he turned and walked away, but not before slipping something into the mailbox. Inside was a folded piece of paper. One line written in blocky black ink. "Next time we come in." That was the moment I knew I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was a liability. And if I didn't do something soon, they weren't going to just take what they wanted, they were going to make me disappear too. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with every light on in the house, the pouch in front of me, my fingers tracing the zipper line over and over. Outside, the street stayed eerily quiet, but every engine in the distance, every creak of the wind, made me flinch. I kept the paper from the mailbox next to the old flip phone. For hours, I stared between them like they might suddenly give me an answer. In the end, it was the memory of Ellie's mother's face that finally pushed me to move. I didn't do it because I was brave. I did it because if I didn't, someone else might die, and this time it would be because of me. Just after dawn, I went to the police station, not to confess, but to observe. I didn't bring the pouch. I just asked about the investigation. Said I wanted to know what would happen next. The woman at the front desk, kind but distracted, told me the detective would be in touch. I waited an hour anyway. When no one came, I went home, pulled the blinds shut, and did something I'd never done before. I looked through every file Jake had left on his laptop. I found messages, transactions, notes. There were nicknames I didn't recognize, codes that seemed childish, Silverleaf, Night Eyes, 6X. But the payment histories were real. Dates lined up with the nights he'd come home late. A few names repeated. One in particular caught my eye, Link. No last name, but enough exchanges to show a pattern. I printed the records, stuffed them into a folder, and hid it behind the insulation in the attic crawl space. Just in case. I knew then that if I couldn't stop what Jake had started, I'd at least have evidence that he hadn't been acting alone. The real shift came when I tried to go back to work. It had been 2 weeks. My supervisor, Doreen, greeted me with her usual tight smile, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. That morning, I noticed whispers that stopped when I walked past. Lunchroom conversations that shifted as soon as I entered. And then, just before my shift ended, I found an envelope taped to my locker. No note. Just a photocopy of a police report from a raid last fall, names redacted, but Jake's initials were visible. One paragraph underlined. Suspected connection to minor distribution cell in Western District. Someone knew. I didn't confront anyone. I simply took the envelope home, slid it into the folder in the attic, and called out sick the next day. That evening, the threatening calls returned. Different voice this time, higher-pitched, nervous. "We know you've got it," he said. "If you want this to go away, you better come talk to us." I didn't answer. I just hung up, then disconnected the landline entirely. I considered leaving town. Just vanishing. I could stay with my cousin in Vermont.
Take a break.
But that felt like surrender. Worse, it felt like erasure, like letting them rewrite Jake's legacy with rumors and fear. Instead, I started taking small steps. I stopped throwing things away. I documented everything: calls, texts, even suspicious cars parked outside too long. I photographed tire marks, collected fragments of conversation I overheard from neighbors. I stopped being a mother in mourning and started becoming a witness, a record keeper. But even as I built my quiet defense, the people around me turned colder. Ellie's mother didn't wave anymore. The pastor stopped calling. A woman from church crossed the street when she saw me coming. It didn't take long to realize the whispers had reached the neighborhood. Jake was dealing. She's hiding something. She must have known. Even the kids at the community center, the ones Jake used to tutor in algebra, stopped coming by. The lowest point came when I found a brick through the back window. No note. Just shattered glass on the floor where Jake's sneakers used to be. I swept it up in silence. Didn't call the police. I already knew they wouldn't find anything, and maybe I didn't want them to. I wasn't ready for questions I couldn't afford to answer truthfully. Still, in all the chaos, a small shift was happening inside me. I was no longer just scared. I was angry. Not just at the men who threatened me, but at the system that had ignored Jake when he first asked for help. At the therapists who dismissed his anxiety as adjustment issues. At the rehab center that discharged him after 19 days with no follow-up. And yes, even at myself for not digging deeper when I saw the signs. For letting him convince me he was fine when he clearly wasn't. Then, in the middle of that storm, something unexpected happened. A girl knocked on my door. She couldn't have been more than 20, pale, shaking, hoodie sleeves pulled over her knuckles. She asked for Jake. When I told her he'd passed, she didn't cry. She just nodded, stared at the porch railing, and whispered, "He told me if anything happened to him, I should come here." I led her inside, slowly. Sat her on the couch. Her name was Marcy. She said she used to meet Jake behind the skate park. Said he'd helped her get clean, gave her things to sell, so she wouldn't have to use. Told her to run if things got weird. Then she pulled out a flash drive and said, "This is names. People bigger than Jake. I don't know who they are, but he said it would help you if it got bad." I didn't ask why she trusted me. I didn't even ask why Jake had trusted her. I just took the flash drive, locked the front door, and told her she could sleep on the couch if she needed to. That night, she stayed. The next day, she disappeared. But she left behind her name and a number. It was the first time in weeks I'd felt anything like hope. The flash drive confirmed what I feared, and something more. Jake hadn't been the top. He'd been a pawn. There were messages, transactions, even audio recordings. One of them had a man's voice saying, "Kid better keep his mouth shut. No loyalty, no future." Another file showed a payment trail that linked back to a business in town. Someone real.
Someone I could name.
I copied it all.
Twice.
Then I picked up the phone and dialed a number I had written and erased 100 times. Detective Ramos answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm, unreadable. "This is Ramos." I swallowed. "I have something," I said. "And I'm ready to talk. But only if you promise Jake's name won't be the only one in your file." There was a pause. Then she said, "Tell me everything." And for the first time since my son died, I wasn't alone. Detective Ramos arrived the next morning at exactly 9 a.m.
M.
She came alone, dressed plainly in gray slacks and a navy cardigan, a legal pad tucked under one arm, and her ID already in hand. I opened the door before she knocked. We didn't exchange small talk. I simply pointed her to the dining table, where I had already set out the pouch, the folder, the phone, and the flash drive. She didn't speak right away. She just sat down, her eyes moving from object to object like she was taking mental fingerprints before touching anything. When she finally looked at me, it wasn't with sympathy, it was with readiness. "Let's start with what you know," she said. And so I did. I told her about the names on the folded paper I had burned, about the boys from the neighborhood, the list of supplies, the pouch Jake had hidden in his closet. I told her about the envelope at work, the phone calls, the brick through the window. I showed her the records I'd printed from Jake's laptop. I gave her the flash drive for Marcy, though I left Marcy's last name out for now. I wasn't going to hand over someone else's life until I knew this was more than damage control. He wasn't innocent, I said finally. But he wasn't in control either. They used him. Ramos didn't argue. She didn't offer comfort. She took notes, asked for dates, cross-checked what I said with the drive's metadata. At one point, she pulled out her phone and took a photo of the Red X baggie. "We've seen this before," she muttered, mostly to herself. 3 towns over. That was when I knew this went deeper than I'd guessed. It wasn't just a local ring. Jake had stumbled into something wider, and he hadn't known how to get out. At the end of the meeting, I asked what would happen next. Ramos didn't lie. "We'll open an investigation, but I need you to be aware, this isn't going to be quiet. If your son was connected to active distributors, people will come looking for what you gave me." She folded her notepad, placed the phone into a secure evidence bag, and slid it into her briefcase. "Do you have somewhere safe to go?" I didn't answer. I was already thinking about Vermont. That evening, I packed a bag not just for myself, but for safety. Bank statements, a copy of the flash drive, a second phone I'd bought in cash. I left the porch light off for the first time in years. And just before midnight, I got the call I had been bracing for. The voice was familiar now, cool, flat male. "You've been busy," he said. "You should have just left it alone." Then he hung up. That was it. No demand. No threat. Just a warning, one that said I was now a target. The next morning, I didn't go to work. I didn't even stay home. I went to the hardware store, bought a deadbolt, a second lock for the back door, and a motion sensor light. Then I drove to a storage facility outside town and rented a unit under a fake name. I moved all the copies there, the files, the backups, even the photos I'd printed. If they came for me, I wanted to make sure they didn't take everything. Still, the house didn't feel safe anymore. I kept the curtains drawn, slept on the couch with a flashlight in my hand. When the knock came 3 days later, I almost didn't open the door. But this time, it wasn't a stranger. It was Ellie's mother. She stood on the porch in a raincoat, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, a plastic container in her hands. "Chicken soup," she said quietly. "Don't ask why. I just needed to do something." I stepped aside, let her in. We didn't talk about Jake or Ellie, or what either of us suspected. We just sat at the table, 2 women with too many unspoken truths between them, eating in silence. But as she left, she touched my shoulder and said, "If you ever need someone to watch your back, call me." I nodded. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something beyond fear. The next day, Detective Ramos called with an update. "We traced the voice on the phone," she said. "It's connected to a man named Lincoln Shea. Known affiliate. You were right. Your son wasn't working alone. She hesitated. But this also means we need your statement on record. Officially. I knew what that meant. Once my statement was filed, it could be subpoenaed. It could become part of the trial. Jake's name would enter the system, even if it was under redacted terms. I hung up and stared at the floor for almost an hour. Then I drove to the police station. I gave my statement, every detail, every lie I'd told, every truth I'd buried. I signed the papers. I looked Ramos in the eye and said, "Just promise me one thing. Don't let them make him the villain. He didn't deserve that." She nodded, her jaw tight. "We won't." It was raining when I left the station. Not a storm, just a soft, steady curtain of gray. I walked slowly to the car, the folder lighter than before. For the first time since Jake died, I didn't feel like I was hiding. I felt exposed, but also freed. That night, I slept without the flashlight. No calls came, no knocks, just the sound of wind against the siding and the low hum of the fridge. I wasn't safe, not yet, but I had finally turned the tide. I had stopped lying. And now the story wasn't just theirs to tell. It was mine too. The morning after I gave my official statement, the house felt foreign. I moved through it like a guest, uncertain which parts still belonged to me. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was hollow, like everything had shifted half an inch off center. The kitchen was clean, but it smelled faintly of burnt toast from the night before. Jake's room, still untouched, looked more like a museum than a memory. I didn't go in. I didn't need to. The pieces of him that I'd been clinging to were no longer in the physical things. They were now embedded in the consequences of what I'd set in motion. 3 days later, a white envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, an official notice that my name had been redacted from a sealed affidavit submitted to the district attorney. It meant the investigation was moving forward. It also meant I was now legally part of it, even if anonymous. I folded the paper carefully and slid it into the folder in my bedroom closet, the one I now kept locked. The fallout began slowly. First came the silence. The calls from coworkers stopped. Doreen texted once. "Heard you're taking more time off. Hope everything's okay," but didn't reply when I answered. Then someone from church removed me from the prayer chain email. The unsubtle distancing didn't hurt as much as I thought it would. What hurt was realizing how few people had ever really known Jake. Not the boy he had been, not the broken young man he became, but the person who had tried, quietly, messily, to protect others by putting himself at risk. Then, a week after the interview, I got a call from Detective Ramos. "There's been an arrest," she said. "Lincoln Shea. We used the flash drive and your statement to pin him on distribution across 3 counties. There may be more." She paused before adding, "Your son's name will remain sealed. But this isn't over. Others might push back." I thanked her, but my voice was flat. The truth is, the arrest didn't feel like justice. It felt like opening a gate to a field of landmines. Just because we stepped through didn't mean we were safe. In the days that followed, I tried to rebuild something resembling routine. I returned to the grocery store, nodded at neighbors without expecting a smile back. I cleaned the garage, sorted old bills, planted herbs in the narrow plot beside the porch, things that required my hands more than my mind. Grief doesn't evaporate. It settles. It changes shape. Some mornings I woke up convinced Jake was down the hall. Some nights I swore I heard footsteps. But I didn't cry. I just moved. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of Jake's school papers, I found a drawing I didn't remember. A sketch of a house, ours, but with taller windows, solar panels, and a note scrawled across the roof. "One day I'll fix it all." I sat on the floor, tracing the lines with my thumb, letting the silence stretch. That piece of paper, just a doodle, somehow made him more real than the pouch or the flash drive or the court records ever could. It reminded me of the Jake I'd nearly forgotten in all the damage control, the boy who still believed in repairing things. That evening, I sent a message to Marcy. I kept it short. He didn't forget you. Thank you for the drive. She responded a few hours later with 3 words that stayed with me longer than anything else. He saved me. I didn't need more. It was enough. But peace was never permanent. 2 nights later, I found my front gate unlatched and swinging in the wind. Nothing was missing. No signs of forced entry. But the mailbox had been left open, empty, as if someone had searched it. The next morning, a dead rat appeared on my doorstep, its body carefully placed, not tossed. A message, subtle and cruel. I called Ramos and they logged the report, but I already knew what she would say. Without video, without a name, it would go nowhere. That was when I decided to leave. Not run, but shift. I contacted my cousin in Vermont. Explained enough without explaining everything. She said I could come for the summer, bring what I needed, stay as long as I wanted. That weekend, I packed a suitcase and 3 boxes. I left most of Jake's things where they were, but took the folder, the backup drive, and the sketch. Before I left, I taped a small note inside Jake's closet. This room mattered. Don't let them erase you. I didn't know who I was writing it for, myself, maybe. Or for some stranger who might live there one day. But it felt necessary. The drive north was long and quiet. I took back roads, kept the radio off. When I reached my cousin's cottage, small, creaky, tucked near the edge of a lake, I felt something I hadn't in months. Breath. Not relief, but air. Room to expand. Here, life is smaller. I help her tend chickens. I sweep the porch. I take walks alone and let the woods absorb what the house back home couldn't hold. No one here knows Jake. They just know I lost a son. They don't ask how. They don't need to. Still, each night before bed, I check the locks. I keep a flashlight by the window. I haven't stopped being vigilant. But I'm no longer ruled by fear. I'm living alongside it. One morning last week, I saw a girl about Marcy's age on a bike, riding past the post office with a look of quiet purpose. She reminded me of the kids Jake used to tutor, the way they'd concentrate so hard when pretending not to care. I stood there watching her until she disappeared around the bend. For a moment, I felt something like pride, not for the life Jake had lost, but for the lives he may have saved, even if only briefly. I know this story isn't done. There may be more knocks, more letters, more people who want to rewrite what happened. But I also know this. I did what mothers aren't supposed to admit. They lied, destroyed, hid. But I also did what many wouldn't dare. I told the truth when it cost me everything. And now I'm learning how to live with that choice. Not cleanly, not quietly, but completely. It was early June when I finally returned home. The garden had overgrown while I was gone, wild mint sprouting up through the cracks in the stone path, vines curling like fingers around the porch railings. I let the key sit in the lock a full minute before I turned it. The air inside was stale but familiar. The house hadn't been touched. Everything was just as I'd left it, except for me. I walked through each room slowly, not like a mourner, but like someone reclaiming space. In Jake's room, the air was still faintly scented with the lavender sachet I'd tucked into his drawer a year before he died. I didn't cry. I just opened the window and let the breeze move through it. There were no new messages waiting. No signs that anyone had tried to follow. Detective Ramos had sent a final update before I left Vermont. Lincoln Shea had taken a plea deal. Several other names had surfaced. A wider case was underway, But Jake's name hadn't been leaked, not even once. True to her word, Ramos had kept him out of the headlines. She'd written complicated involvement, non-primary actor in her notes. That's what the law saw, a small player. But I had seen the truth of it. He wasn't a footnote in someone else's empire. He was a boy who got trapped trying to protect people in a world that punishes silence and honesty in equal measure. I spent the first few days back rebuilding normal. I donated half my clothes. I called the nursing home and formally resigned. I replaced the broken gate and pulled the dead vines from the porch. Not because I thought life could go back to what it was, but because I needed to make space for whatever would come next. I didn't know what I believed anymore about healing, but I understood something new about survival. It happens in small, ordinary actions, not dramatic rebirths. One afternoon, I found the drawing again, the house Jake had imagined. The one with the taller windows and the solar panels. I had almost tucked it back into storage, but instead I framed it, hung it above the dining table. It wasn't a shrine. It was a reminder that his story wasn't just what had happened to him, but also what he had hoped to build. Something better. Something that didn't yet exist, but maybe still could. In early July, I applied to volunteer with a community center across town. They ran tutoring programs for teens, math, reading, coding. When I showed up for the interview, the director, a woman named Clara, glanced at my resume, then looked at me directly and said, "You've worked with grief, haven't you?" I didn't answer right away. I just nodded. She didn't ask for more. That summer, I taught two boys who reminded me so much of Jake it made my chest tighten. One of them, Ryan, struggled with focus. The other, Caleb, had a laugh that was too loud for quiet rooms. They didn't know my story. They didn't need to. But one afternoon after class, Caleb stayed behind to ask if I thought it was okay to cut off friends who made him feel unsafe. I told him yes. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is leave before someone else chooses for you. He didn't say much, just nodded and walked out into the sun. That night, I lay on the couch watching the shadows shift across the ceiling. I realized I hadn't checked the locks in 3 days. I hadn't listened for phantom cars or braced for phone calls that never came. I wasn't unafraid, but I wasn't frozen anymore either. Grief still visits, mostly in the early mornings. I'll reach for 2 mugs instead of 1. I'll see a boy on a bike and think it's Jake from behind. But the ache has softened. It no longer stops me mid-step. Now it just walks beside me. Last week, I got a message from Marcy. She's in Ohio now, clean in school and volunteering at a shelter. She wrote, "I don't tell people about Jake. Not because I'm ashamed, but because I want to keep that part of him mine." I sat with her words for a long time, understood them completely. We had both protected different versions of the same boy, and we were both learning how to live without having to explain why. I don't know if I'll stay in this house forever. Sometimes I dream of moving somewhere near water. Sometimes I dream of disappearing entirely. But for now, I live here, quietly, simply. I go to the community center twice a week. I grow herbs that I actually use. I open the windows even when it rains. There are things I still carry, and things I've stopped apologizing for. This isn't the ending I ever imagined, but it's mine.